I'm ready to sew these pieces together. Notice how I pinned along the stitching line with the point of the pin towards the center of the seam and the ball of the pin facing the direction of the basting stitches. The goal of me pinning this is so that the pin runs along the stitching line on both the front and the back. And notice how these edges don't match. That's fine. When I sew with a stitch length of 2. I sew from the center approximately. You don't have to be perfectly centered towards the basted edge, and I remove the pin as I sew. I'm also using a walking foot. Notice how my stitches are starting back on the previous stitches. I make sure that it's not too far from the stitching line on both pieces and that it doesn't go past the dots that I drew at the very top of these series of dots. This is the stitching line I just completed. I'm going to remove these basting stitches, and then I'm going to position this quilt block right sides together on the back, baste these 2 sets of points joining the back to the side piece, and then stitch this line. This is all 3 pieces sewn together with the basting stitches removed, and now we're going to add pieces up here to the top. Notice this angle is different from this angle because the piece was cut incorrectly, so the angle put on here was incorrect as well. Normally they would all be facing the same direction. So I'm going to flip this to the right side in order to add more pieces. When I begin adding pieces, I simply make sure that the piece looks good next to the piece that's already installed. If it doesn't, I flip it around. I happen to like them meeting on an angle, so that's the way I'm going to position this. I position it right sides together on top of the center, and then I baste these 2 areas together. So from the center front, this is how the stitching line looks. This is the stitching line I just installed from here to here only. I stopped at the point. So this piece will be flipped up, and you can see how the honeycomb is beginning to be built. This is the piece I just added, and I joined it to the center piece only. I didn't join it anywhere else. So from the inside, the centerpiece has 3 seams now, one over here that's not joined to any other, and these 2 seams. When I open it out, all of the pieces are only joined to the center. I'm going to flip this to the right side again, and I'm going to add another piece just to the center. How I do that is I position the piece so that I think it looks good. In other words, if I had it turned this way, the pumpkins would be hitting each other at angles that I think are unusual. So I will turn it this way, fold it onto the center, baste these points together, and then sew this seam. This is the seam I've sewn between these 2 basted edges. When I pull out the quilt block that's hidden behind here, you'll start to see a fan shape. Notice that none of these edges are joined together yet. They're all hanging loose, and the only place I've sewn is between dots. And you can also notice that my stitching lines meet but don't go past those dots. That's very important. Normally I would not do this step until all the pieces were joined to the center, but because this is a class, we're going to be talking about other parts of this quilt next week. So if you can only get this part done, you'll be in good shape for the next class where we talk about turning under these edges. Now I usually join each hexagon to its neighbor along the seam. I do this by basting them again or pinning them along the dotted line because that does stop them from pulling out of shape. So I'm going to go do that and show you how that looks. And if you have this much done by the time we meet next time, you'll be in great shape. Okay, I can guess what you're thinking. Wow, what is this? You'll notice that I have all the pieces that I'm going to sew together, baste it together. And I'm going to take them over to the sewing machine and sew these seams now. Once everything's sewn together, and these are the seams I just installed, this is how your piece will look. If you have pad stitching, it will look a little different because it'll have decorative material on the top, but we're not pad stitching these. And if you have your piece completed to this point, we can get a lot done next class, so please try and do that.